In the last section of the course, we talked all about advanced DOM topics, and in this section, we're going to be talking about modulars and bundlers. And specifically in this video, we're going to be talking about ES6 modules, also known as browser modules, and these modules are some of the most useful and amazing features ever added to JavaScript. So the way that a module works is it allows you to take code from one file. For example, we have this user.js file, which contains two user objects and a function for printing out a user. It allows us to take code from this file and import it into this file without having to reference both files inside of our code. Because normally, the way you would do this is you would create another script tag with a source of user.js. We're going to defer that. And now inside of our script.js, since it loads after our user.js, we have access to everything inside of here. So I could just say console.log me, for example. Make sure I save this, and you'll see that it prints out the me object, which has my name and agent here. We could also say print user of me, and it's going to print out name Kyle, age 25, which is what this print user function down here does when we pass it a user. The downside to doing this, though, is that it's really confusing to see where does print user come from, where does me come from, and also if I had another JavaScript file, we'll say script2, now all of my user variables, for example, me, Sally, and print user, are going to be defined inside of script2 as well. And we most likely don't want that because we're not using the user information in script2. We're only using it in this first script file. So it just pollutes the global namespace because everything defined in here is now defined globally across all of our application. And we don't necessarily want that. We only want it to be defined in this script.js. But we want it to be a separate file so that our code is cleaner and easier to work with. This is where modules come in. So let's clean this up so we just have our script.js. And of course, we're getting an error because print user is not defined, and that's because we have no reference to this print user anymore. So in order to get a reference to print user into here, we first need to tell this user.js file that we are exporting data out of it to be used in other places. So let's say that we want to export this me variable and this print user down here. We'll start with just me. What we can do is we can say export me. What this is doing is it's saying that I want to export this me variable outside of this code. Now, if I save this, you're going to notice nothing actually happens, but in our script.js, we can actually import that me in. We could come in here and say that we wanted to import me from /user.js. And really what this / is doing is it's telling us use our current directory, the current folder we're in, which is just our current project folder, and then get the file called user.js inside of that folder. So there's the user.js file right here. Let's just do console.log me. This is going to give us a bunch of problems immediately. When we save, you're going to see the first problem we get is cannot use import statement outside of module. What this is essentially saying is that our browser has no idea what import means. And the reason for that is we didn't tell our browser that we're using modules. What you need to do inside of your script tag is give it a type, and this type needs to be module. Now when I save, you can see that we're no longer getting the import error, we're getting a different error, which we're going to tackle in a little bit. But this is telling our browser that we are using modules inside of our code, so it needs to handle our code likewise. And the nice thing about using type module is it automatically gives us the defer attribute. We can remove defer because it's automatically going to be set to defer. So now let's handle this error over here, unexpected token export. What exactly is going on? The way that you export outside of a file, there's two different ways. You can do export me, just like we have here, or you can do an export default, just like this. And let's just do an export default first. The export default essentially says this is the default thing that I'm going to be exporting out of this file. And if I save this, you can see that everything's working, it's hooked up. And the default export is essentially this thing you define between the import and the from. So this right here is our default export, which in our case is this me. And we can rename this to whatever we want. I could call this Kyle, and now I could console log Kyle. And you can see it says name Kyle, age 25, so it's still getting that object. We can rename the default export to whatever we want, and anything we put between import and from is just going to be the name of our default export. Fairly straightforward. We just put export default and the name of the thing that we want to default. On top of that, we can also do non-default exports. These are called named exports. So let's export Sally. And what we do is we just say export and then the name of the thing we want to export. So we could just come up here and say export Sally. So we can nicely put this in front of our const variable, which is really nice. So we can just put the keyword export in front of where our variable is defined. And now if we save, everything works as before, but now we can import Sally from here as well. So to do this, we can just put a comma, and then inside of curly brackets, we need to put the actual thing that we're importing. In our case, it is called Sally. And you must write this with the exact same name as what you had inside of this file. So our name Sally here needs to be exactly the same between the two. And now, if we print out Sally, you can see it's properly printing her out. Now, let's say that we wanted to make our default export to this print user function instead. So let's come up here and export the me variable, just like this, and remove this default export down here. Save that. And now over here, we want Kyle and Sally to be inside of these named exports. So now if we save, we're of course getting an error. And it's saying the requested module ./user.js does not provide an export named Kyle. And that's because in here this is called me. And remember I said that these need to have the exact same name. Now this is going to properly work. What happens if we wanted this to actually be called Kyle? What you can do is put a space, the word as, and then give it a new name. So we're taking me, we're importing it from ./user, and we're renaming it to Kyle. Now if I just print out Kyle, you can see it properly prints out this me variable because we remapped it to the name Kyle. So inside of user.js, we're exporting this constant variable and this constant variable here, but so far we haven't exported our print user. And we could do an export default of print user just like this. And now in our script, we could just get print user as our default export. And we could swap this out for print user. And now you can see it's printing out name Kyle age 25, just like we would expect. We could change this to just say print. And of course, since it's our default export, we can name it whatever we want, and it's always going to be the default export. And that's because you can only ever have one default export from a file. That's why they call it the default. It is the thing that you're importing by default, and everything else is a named import because you need to know the name of it to import it. But something interesting about functions is you can move the export default onto the same line where you define the function, just like this. That's going to give us the exact same code. As you can see, this is still working after I save. But we can't do that up here with constant variables. We can't do export default and then a const. It just doesn't work. You can only do that with named exports for constant variables, or just any variables for that matter. And same thing if we wanted to do an export down here of Sally, we couldn't do this just like this. We have to put the export where we define the constant variable itself as opposed to doing it down here. But if we wanted to do a default export, this is where we would define it. We would have to define it later after we define our constant variable. So it would look like this if Sally was our default export. A little bit confusing, but essentially when you're exporting variables, put the export keyword on the same line. Unless it's the default export, then it must go on a separate line. And with functions, you can do it on the same line or a separate line. It doesn't really matter. And it doesn't matter if it's a normal export or a default export. You can do it on the same line or on a separate line. It really doesn't matter. Let's just move this back to normal export and we'll save. And that is essentially how you export things between different modules inside of JavaScript. So here we have one module with 3 different things we're exporting. And then inside of this, we're importing those 3 different things and we're using them inside of here. We can even print out Sally, for example, just so we're using everything. And you can see that it is all working. And the way that this path works is you're going to be giving it a relative path to where you are. So right now we're at script.js. Let's say that we created a new folder called JS and we moved our user.js into there. Now you'll notice that this tries to auto update itself. We're just going to get rid of what was in here and put user.js back in there. That's what we had. And we'll save and we'll get an error. It says cannot get, localhost port 5001 users.js. It's saying there's no file at this location. And that's because our current folder is script.js and it's looking inside this folder to find a user.js file. There is none. We need to go into the JS folder, and then inside the JS folder, we have a user.js file. Now if we save, this is going to properly work as we would expect. Similar thing happens if our script is inside the JS file and our user is outside of it. What we need to do in that case is we need to go backwards outside of this JS directory. And to do that, you just put 2 dots. That's going to move you backwards. Now we can put a slash and we can do user.js. And now if we, inside of our index.html, just change this to be js/script.js, you'll see everything is working because we properly updated the name inside of our index.html. And inside of here, we're properly linking to this user.js. If we went inside another folder, for example, JS2, we put the script inside of there, And our HTML, we just made sure that this was properly linked up. There we go. You see we get an error. We cannot find user.js. That's because we need to go backwards twice. So we can do // user.js just like this. It automatically corrected that for me. Now when I click save, you can see that it properly works. So this ... just moves us up one directory, while if we want to go down directories, in the other example where we put user inside of here and script outside of here, we would just need to say /js/js2/user.js. Now if I just update this path, you'll see all of our code is back to working. Now the last thing I want to tell you about modules is how to support browsers that don't actually support modules. Because only about 93% of browsers at the time of recording this video support modules. And while that is most of the browsers, it is important to understand how to work without support of modules. And the way to do this is by using a special script tag. So we can create a script tag here, and this script tag needs to have the attribute no_module. And if you put this attribute on your script tag, this is going to run the scripts inside of this script tag if your browser does not support modules. But if your browser does support modules, it's going to pretend like this doesn't even exist. And if your browser doesn't support modules, it won't know what to do with this code, so it won't run this code. It's as if this doesn't exist. So inside of here, we could put a source that's, script without modules.js. And this would be all of your code without the modules all combined together somehow. Generally though, this is not how most people handle browsers that don't support modules. Instead, they use something called a bundler, which is what we're going to be talking about in the later half of this section of this course. So it's important to understand this idea of no module, but in practice, you're pretty much never going to be using no module because your bundler is going to take care of all of that for you. Now in the next video, I'm going to be talking about how you can use modules inside of Node.js because modules in Node.js actually work differently than modules inside of the browser. This is why many times you'll hear this referred to as ES6 modules. And then for Node, you'll hear that be called common modules or node modules or something like that. But ES6 modules and node modules are different. And in the next video, I'm going to be explaining node modules.